Hello, my name is Todd Brosman. I've been a practicing musician practically my whole life, focusing mostly on jazz and improvisational piano, more recently on composition and production. Um, Publicly, I've worked semi-professionally as a gigging jazz musician, piano teacher, composer, producer, working along other artists as well as independently. Um, Music and piano have been a central part of my life since I was very young. When I was 6, I was at a local electronics store with my mom, and while she was getting the VCR repaired, I stumbled into the music room and began fiddling with a small Casio keyboard that was on display. And that was that. I was immediately hooked, and I convinced my mom to buy it for me and started taking lessons. My excitement for playing music has continued to this day, and the practice and performance of music has been a consistent part of my life and very rewarding for me in terms of interpersonal growth. But it's also brought its share of challenges, not just the obvious technical ones, but emotional ones as well. And the nature of these joys and struggles are what we'll be delving into in this presentation. While informed primarily by my own experience and that of other musicians I met along the way, I hope for there to be a universal relatability of this talk, of interest to those with even more casual musical practices, and hopefully also translatable to others' personal pursuits, whether they be creative or otherwise. Um, so with the exception of those few musically anhedonic souls, effectively, everyone seems to have a strong and personal connection with music. Amy's research seems to validate this. I've come across many who don't get much out of, say, poetry or visual art, other types of art forms, but only a very few seem to not have some degree of a personal relationship with music. There does seem to be something profoundly universal and fundamental to the human experience about it. Perhaps it's inherently temporal in experiential nature, or its ability to capture and evoke not only the narrative and literal, but also the abstract and intangible. Also the way, as Amy said, that it can invoke memories and is, tied into neurology in interesting ways. Um, here's But most people at some point in their life either take up or think about taking up a musical instrument at some point in their lives. Here's some quick stats, but essentially the main takeaway is that indeed nearly everyone at some point in their life at least flirts with the idea of playing music. And again, this is maybe to be expected given how universal and powerful the musical experience is. It's only natural people would be inclined to explore and connect with it, the experience of music as deeply as possible by attempting to make it themselves. So let's get into the nature of what some of these subjective rewards of playing music actually are. Why play music? Firstly, and perhaps the most immediate, is the joy to be had from simply engaging in the act of creation itself. To create something out of nothing from your own hands, it's very exciting. One doesn't even have to be terribly proficient to access this joy. As children, we may remember feeling quite free with our creative expression and taking great pleasure in it. When I first laid hands on that Casio keyboard as a 6-year-old, the excitement was immediate. I was no prodigy and I didn't necessarily have anything salient I was trying to express, but I was simply exploring the sounds made by the different keys and seeing how notes could be strung together. And it was thrilling and it was new and I was hooked. But I was young. And when young, this creative openness and freedom can seem quite accessible and immediate. We have far less fear and inhibition associated with expression. We don't ask ourselves if something is good or worthy. Things simply are. It's all new, it's all interesting. But as we grow, we become self-aware, we begin to apply judgment and value to things. We start building a model of how we're being seen by others. This complicates things a bit. We'll get a bit into self-judgment and self-consciousness later. But with that aside, as we grow, it's still only natural that achieving these states of creative openness and freedom would require a bit more than simply the retention of a youthful spirit, because novelty inevitably wanes and our inner lives become more complex. But I found it is indeed possible to maintain or rediscover this youthful inhibition and joy as an adult. More does seem to be required, but with the commitment and intention, these moments do remain accessible. And when wedded with the experience and proficiency, these experiences take on a whole new dimension. The height of these experiences are quite something. Often called flow states or zone states, one can experience them as an expansive sense of freedom emerging with or channeling of something beyond oneself. I typically experience these moments as being a passive observer to my own playing, as if I'm watching the music unfold before me, and it's very cool. But again, these are peak experiences and certainly don't happen every time, at least not for me. They can, in fact, typically be quite rare, but nevertheless, that simple joy of creation does remain to be had at any age and level of proficiency. So now moving on to some of the additional subjective rewards of playing music, let's talk about emotions. Bam. The human experience is, to me, at its core, an emotional one, regardless of what others consider to be, say, the purpose or meaning of life, whether that be connection, achievement, divine duty, or even if you think life is devoid of meaning altogether. Emotions, in all cases, still remain the experiential substrate of our existence and all our growth and struggles. So, what is the nature of the musician's or artist's impulse to channel and incite emotion? Why not just feel? Why not continue to simply cry, laugh, and smile? Or just suck it up and get on with life? And to answer that, I want to present the model that I find to be most effective when contemplating emotions, and that is one of absorption and expression. As said earlier, the human experience is an emotional one, and many, if not all, of the events and encounters we experience incite some degree of an emotional response. Whether it's minute or dramatic depends on the experience, the timing, the individual's constitution. But either way, an experience will be absorbed, and one's feeling state and mental state will, to some degree, be altered. That absorbed energy will resultantly require some sort of management or expression in order to integrate into one's broader experience. This can be immediate or delayed, constructive or destructive, mindful or unconscious. But either way, emotional energies ultimately will find some way to express themselves. And if enough emotional energy gets indefinitely held in the body without the opportunity or tools for outward expression, it will still express itself internally, potentially leading to an experience of neurosis, disjointedness, even physical ailment. But irrespective of our individual constitutions and events of our lives, we all inevitably end up with our share of backlogged and stuck emotional energies. After all, life is immense, heavy, complicated, and expecting anyone to have the tools, time, and circumstance to process and integrate everything in a constructive and timely manner is simply unrealistic, especially for the more sensitive and receptive among us. So in the end, most of us live inner emotional lives we feel are deeper than we are able to outwardly show, express, and fully work out. And this disparity can often result in a sense of loneliness and alienation associated with such deeper feelings. So thus, we have another major impulse to express ourselves creatively, to give voice and expression to these deeper emotional dimensions, to attempt to externalize and integrate them into our broader lives. By channeling music, we can channel the more complex and elusive facets of human emotion and subjective experience, taking them from something stuck, ununderstood, stagnant, unmanaged, into something seen, heard, and known. And when I say seen, heard, and known, I don't necessarily just mean by others, but also by ourselves. While I've had many opportunities to share my music with others and gotten great pleasure from it, for me, the pursuit of a musical practice has primarily been a personal one. It's been an impulse born from a desire to affirm and reflect my own inner reality back to myself, which has helped me integrate and sort out my own congested emotions. And for that, the musical practice has served me quite well, and I recommend it. And one need not ever perform for another to get this benefit if one wishes. You can let it be entirely personal. But of course, many do ultimately want to perform for others and share their expression in the hopes of feeling more seen and understood by the world, not just oneself, and also in the hopes of helping others channel their own emotional energies. And this can lead to a broader sense of integration and connection for everyone. A great musician's magic is often in their ability to evoke not only a celebration of our universal commonality, but simultaneously a celebration of our individual distinctiveness and uniqueness. Even if an artist is reflecting experiences that are very particularly unique to them and in a form of expression that is similarly unique and personal, there can nonetheless be the potential for that universal relatability. And I'm sure we've all experienced that before. So those are some of the, reasons why people might be compelled to create music. What are some of the challenges? Well, firstly, as much as we do wish to be seen and understood by others, the prospect of feeling seen also terrifies us. Through seeking exposure and connection, we also risk rejection, judgment, misunderstanding, which are all outcomes that would only leave us feeling all the more disconnected and alone. So there's an inherent vulnerability to creative expression. Even performing the most simple and emotionally neutral pieces in front of others can feel like walking a tightrope with our pants down. We may worry that if we make a mistake, that the moment to finally be seen will forever be lost or diminished. We may worry that if we play too stiffly, people will think we're uptight. If we play too loosely, that we're immature. We may fear that instead of being seen as the rich, emotional souls we know ourselves to be, that will instead be seen as perhaps a fanciful and indulgent child, putting on big boy pants and hoping to be taken seriously. Worse yet, we may fear that this is indeed all we actually are. And that brings us to shame, a heavy topic, but one I'm comfortable talking about only because of how common I found it to be. What is shame, or what is creative shame? It's not only fearing that you're a bad or uninteresting musician. Creative shame is feeling that you're a bad or uninteresting person. The voice of shame may ask, who the heck am I to think I have anything worth expressing and sharing? Childish for me to even think so. My expression would be nothing but a pestering imposition upon the world. These fears and paranoias don't need to reflect any external reality in order to overtake our thoughts and internal narratives. They can feel also very real and paralyzing nonetheless. And this goes beyond when simply performing for others. That sneering voice of shame can also find us in our most private and solitary of moments, and often does. In my earlier years, there were countless a night when alone at the piano, not a soul in earshot, but the voice would inevitably be there, perched upon my shoulder and whispering into my ear. Again, I found that many of us have this voice in our head when it comes to all sorts of things, not just creative expression. And I'll be sharing some of my tips for managing this later on. But first, let's explore one more challenge regarding creative expression, and that is the potential conflict that can arise between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. The drives and incentives to create that we've explored so far were all of a more intrinsic nature, motivations that are driven by internal, soul-oriented desires and rewards. But given the ever-present nature of the human ego, extrinsic motivations are likely to be in the mix as well. These are ones related to external ego-gratifying rewards. The desire to not just be seen as ourselves, but to be seen as more than ourselves, a deep artistic genius, or a sexy superstar. This is all natural. After all, we all have an ego, and the ego has the cunning capacity to co-opt and potentially sully any well-intended pursuit. And noticing this in ourselves can at times fuel our aforementioned feelings of shame, because it does seem to confirm our sense of phoniness. the intrinsic and extrinsic can pull us in opposing directions at times, leaving our artistry stuck in the middle or torn apart. But not necessarily. While many artists' expressive power does come from their natural or practiced ability to maintain humility and keep the ego adequately diffuse, many others manage to successfully lean into it and integrate the ego into their musical embodiment, owning it, if you will, and putting ego front and center. Integrating the extrinsic isn't necessarily shameful, invalid, or inartistic, so long as ultimately it's honest. In the end, musical and artistic expression is all about being honest. And when it comes to music, I think honesty is perhaps the most important quality an artist can infuse into their work. I think even the most lay person of listeners can detect dishonesty in music and be able to sense when music is feeling too put on or forced or infused with an unaware egotism. And this in no way only applies to music attempting a particular level of depth or emotional profundity. Even if your music is completely silly and ridiculous, it still has to be honestly silly and ridiculous. And that will determine whether your audience finds it fun and humorous or simply hokey and lame. But honesty is difficult. It requires openness, a commitment to the intrinsic, and a workable integration of ego. But when it is achieved, that's when the magic can happen. Our individual and universal selves are given expression and affirmed. We are granted the opportunity to feel that which we were always feeling, but in a way that allows for more catharsis and release. But none of this is an easy task. We've explored several challenges here, and they all loom very large. So what are we to do about it? I don't know. This may sound counterintuitive, but at some point I was able to achieve a greater sense of freedom and happiness from my practice by realizing that ultimately the world doesn't really care if I make music or not. My music still remained of a deep importance to me, but I accepted that there was more to me than my creative self. And if I never played music again, the world would keep on spinning. The people close to me would perhaps care because they know how important music is to me, but ultimately they're invested in my happiness, whether that involves music or not. And acknowledging this was actually a big relief to me. It helped me stay grounded in the intrinsic and ultimately more productive. It helped me mitigate the shame and have an easier time sharing my music with others. What I find to be kind of interesting about shame is that there's a certain egotism to it because it puts one and one's imperfections at the center of the universe. It inflates their importance and inflates one's own sense of importance. As obvious and blatant as our creative imperfections can seem to ourselves, others, for the most part, typically don't notice or care. But some people can be judgy. And if you find that some are indeed judging you, acknowledge that this is typically a projection of their own self-judgment. See it for what it is. Be mindful not to judge others, because ultimately it points back to yourself. And so with that humility, we then have more room to be honest with ourselves. We are who we are, so we may as well take a good look in the mirror, figure it out, and get on with it. Are you a sensitive romantic, a cocky rock star, a silly Billy, or all of the above? Me, I'm kind of one part sensitive romantic, one part silly Billy. That's besides the point. You may likely see things in yourself you don't like and want to change, and that will suck and feel uncomfortable, require working out. But those things are going to be there whether acknowledged or not. So it may as well face the music. And that will help you kind of figure out how you want to express yourself, what you have to express, and make that creativity flow more naturally. Another conception that's aided me greatly in learning to frame my relationship with the piano and music is as just that, framing it as an actual relationship. The classical model for this is the idea of a muse, a personified spirit of creative seduction that lures one in, provides the artist with inspiration, infusion, and enrapture. a lover, a romantic partner of sorts, mysterious, alluring, at times chaotic and unpredictable. I don't push this personification of this conceptual muse too hard myself, but I have found that as a model, it does reflect the artistic experience amazingly well and provides a framing that's allowed me to approach my work in a more healthy or productive way. Like any deep relationship, a fruitful and sustainable one with the muse requires listening, patience, respect, and honesty. When I have invested myself honestly and patiently in my art, it's returned passion and romance and harmony. But when I've become needy and demanding or too ego driven, it's typically only bred conflict and stagnation. Before I came to adopt this framing and learn these lessons, my relationship with piano was at times quite dysfunctional. The muse and I would have occasional stretches of passion, but they were interspersed with stretches of quarrel, irritation, and despair. I could be quite demanding and codependent. If I wasn't immediately getting the affirmation I needed, I'd brood or incessantly bang away at the keys in a desperate attempt to squeeze whatever life I could have out of a clearly dead horse, until I'd tire out emotionally. I would eventually still find humility and honesty in that, but it was to be levied upon me only through reaching those limits of exhaustion and despair. And in those moments, I could come crawling back to the muse and find some degree of solace and expression, at least until the next time where I become too needy or demanding, and that cycle would repeat itself yet again. But the muse never abandoned me outright, and my capacity for creative expression would inevitably return. But I was nonetheless stuck in a tiring cycle that wasn't really getting me anywhere. After coming to view my relationship with the muse with my music as indeed a relationship, it became something I felt like I was actually able to understand and work with and grow. By projecting the creative spirit onto some imagined other, a lens was provided through which I could approach and orient my musical practice. Having this model helped me more properly manage my needs, expectations, and insecurities. It allowed me to surrender some degree of control. And what's really interesting about that is that in that surrender, it actually resulted in achieving what came to feel like a much greater sense of control. And that's been great. The muse and I still butt heads occasionally, but for the most part, we've gotten on quite well. There are weeks where we want to spend all of our time together, dancing into the night, and weeks where we need our space. But all in all, we're still deeply in love, and excited about the future. I've managed to significantly quell my feelings of creative shame and confusion, and I hope to all out there who may be facing similar creative challenges or non-creative challenges, that you can as well. And so thank you so much for listening. I really do hope that some of these lessons learned from my experiences can aid you all in some way towards understanding and achieving your own creative pursuits. So thanks again. That concludes.